Dan, always a pleasure speaking to you. And it's a really interesting time when it comes to the heavyweight division. I wanted to focus on Anthony Joshua in particular, and I guess the last 3 years really, because he had that win against Joseph Parker. He had the successful defence at Wembley Stadium, a sold-out Wembley Stadium against Alexander Povetkin. But what do you think has gone wrong for him since then?
I think if something has gone wrong, I mean, look, I think Joshua is still one of the best heavyweights in the world. I think he's still super possible that he regains the heavyweight belts if he has the rematch with Usyk. You know, he's still an outstanding fighter. And what happens is when you're an outstanding fighter and you fight other outstanding fighters, sometimes you're going to lose. But I do feel like maybe AJ lost a little bit of his mojo because of essentially what was almost like a life and death situation. If you go back to the 2017 fight of the year against Vladimir Klitschko, when he got almost within a whisker of getting, not just losing the titles, but getting knocked out when Klitschko dropped him. And of course he came back in dramatic fashion, exciting fashion, and he won that fight and sent the great Vladimir Klitschko into retirement. You know, and again, I have full respect for AJ. I'm a fan of his. I came to London to cover that fight against Klitschko. I have to say that if that fight was just a little bit earlier on, you know, a couple of years earlier when Klitschko wasn't, you know, 40 plus, when Klitschko wasn't coming off of a long layoff, that, you know what, he probably would have finished Anthony Joshua in that situation. But the point is, I don't know if he's ever had the full confidence in himself since that near death, you know, quote unquote experience against Klitschko. And, you know, we can look at different things about what happened in the Andy Ruiz fight, coming to America for the first time, having the late opponent change, maybe being overconfident after scoring his own knockdown early in that fight. And there's, you know, talked about issues in the camp. Maybe there was some kind of injury, talk about how he maybe got, you know, knocked out in the sparring session in the camp, blah, 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 blah. And he came back and he won the fight in great style. But when it came to the Usyk fight, look, he was in with a super talented Hall of Fame level guy, former undisputed champion at cruiserweight, Olympic gold medal winner like himself, and fought the wrong fight, period, in my opinion. And you combine that, maybe you're not quite as confident as you once were, you know, it adds up for a tough night.
What did you make of that initial decision at the start of 2019 to try and break into the US market? And what happened was of course, we thought it was going to be Jarrell Miller. That didn't take place, and it was a late opponent in Andy Ruiz Jr. But in terms of that decision to try and break into the US market and try and, I guess, build a fan base over there,
I thought it was a great move. I mean, there was no doubt that he could draw gigantic crowds and television audiences on pay-per-view throughout the UK. But every great British fighter of recent decades at some point has come to so-called try to conquer America. Lennox Lewis, Ricky Hatton, Joe Calzaghe, Prince Nassim Hamed. You know, you can go on right down the line. If you're a great British fighter, there's something about that makes you want to come and compete in America, where we have more people and more eyeballs on TV and more money and all those kinds of things. And so I respected the fact that Joshua wanted to come and create a new market. You know, as it turned out, on the night of that fight at Madison Square Garden against Andy Ruiz, I was at that fight. That was a huge British crowd. I mean, most of the fans there either were Americans, American, you know, Brits who live in America, or Brits that came across the pond for a nice weekend in New York City to do some shopping and see, you know, the boxing event. But you know, he got a lot of hype here from the folks at the Zone, you know, who are trying to, you know, bring in their new subscribers. And you know, I don't have a problem with him coming here. I wish he would come back. I mean, I know that it's unlikely, at least in the next, you know, the next fight, of course, but I would hope that before his career is over, that Anthony Joshua comes back and fights in the United States. You know, here in America, boxing fans, for the most part, we don't really care what country you're from, what color you are, what your background is. If you can fight and you're exciting, we want to watch you. So he fits the bill there because he's an entertaining fighter with a big personality. And we like that in this country.
It was quite interesting what you said before about maybe AJ lost something that night against Vladimir Klitschko. I wonder if he also lost something that night against Andy Ruiz Jr., because he lost that aura of invincibility, which many UK fans felt towards him. But maybe we haven't seen that same fighter in the ring since that night at Madison Square Garden.
I mean, that's probably a fair point. I mean, if he lost a little bit against Klitschko because of that experience, maybe a little bit more in the knockout loss against Andy Ruiz. I think what people don't recognize sometimes with Joshua is, even though he won the Olympic gold medal, he didn't have a ton of amateur background. I think he only had maybe less than 100 fights, maybe like 60 fights, something like that, maybe even less than that. The point is, he's not one of these guys like Usyk, for example, who had hundreds of amateur fights and all that experience. And when Joshua first got the title shot for the IBF belt against Charles Martin, I can still remember talking to Eddie Hearn, his promoter from Matchroom Boxing, about that matchup and whether or not they should accept or go after Martin to try to make that fight. And Eddie was nervous because Martin at that point was still considered a pretty big step up for Joshua in his pro career compared to the fighters that he had faced before that. Now, Joshua obviously handled Martin with no problem. And Martin, while not a world beater, is still, he's a pretty good heavyweight. He's been in there with some good guys. He's got some solid wins, since that loss. But they were concerned. The point I'm making is that, he went so fast in his professional career. He didn't have that big base foundation that a lot of heavyweights sometimes have before they are put into some big important fight. Joshua was I won't say he was rushed, but he was moved a little bit more quickly for a few reasons. One, the opportunity was there. If you sometimes get a chance to fight for a title, particularly in the heavyweight division, you kind of got to, grab on with both hands and go for it. And on top of that, because the amount of money that he could generate, it didn't make sense to wait, because whatever the situation, if Anthony retires tomorrow, he's, made, I don't know how much money he's made, 9 figures, at least in American money, over 100, probably a couple $100 million in all the big events he's had. But that doesn't have anything to do with the amount of experience and muscle memory and that sort of thing that these fighters have. And, he was still a work in progress while he was heavyweight champion. My hope is that he was able to get his so-called mojo back and get on a nice run and keep bringing in big audiences and big crowds and put on some more great fights.
Credit to AJ for what he did in that rematch against Andy Ruiz Jr. And then he had the successful defense against Pulev as well in 2020. I wonder, when you look back at those two fights now, was there any indication of what we were going to see in the fight against Usyk in September, where he went in with the wrong game plan and he was clearly the inferior fighter against an absolute superstar?
Well, against Andy Ruiz in the rematch, he knew he had gotten stopped in the first fight. Rob McCracken, his trainer, knew what happened in the first fight. And I do think there was a little bit of, nerves and let's make sure we don't get into a firefight again with this guy who maybe was a better puncher than we gave him credit for when we fought him the first time on short notice. So McCracken came up with a game plan that was not exciting, but it was exactly the right thing that Joshua needed to win. And I gave, even in the column I wrote immediately after that fight, a lot of people were negative towards Joshua's performance in that fight because it wasn't exciting. He didn't engage. He kind of fought maybe a little scared to some people's viewpoint. For me, I thought he fought a brilliant fight against Andy Ruiz. He did exactly what he needed to do. There's the old saying, win tonight, look good tomorrow. And that was what he did. He won the fight. He didn't look good necessarily. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't, a great, memorable event. It was a memorable event, I suppose, because of going to Saudi Arabia, but it wasn't a great, memorable fight. But he did what he needed to do to make sure that he didn't lose the second time, that he regained those titles and move forward with his career. So I thought that McCracken came up with a great plan for that fight. I thought AJ did a great job of implementing that plan, because it's one thing for you to have a coach to give you all the right information. It's a totally different plan for you as the athlete to be able to execute it. And not only execute it, but Joshua was able to execute it rounds 1 through 12. He didn't deviate. He didn't get unfocused. Maybe, some guys could put that kind of box and move plan in for 3, 4, 5 rounds. Joshua did it 1 through 12 and did a brilliant job and won essentially every round, and certainly was aided by the fact that Andy Ruiz came into that fight in absolutely terrible condition, did not have his mind or body involved, as far as being motivated for that. I don't understand why he did that, but he had spent way too much time partying and celebrating the win and was in no shape mentally or physically to have the rematch. But nonetheless, Joshua did his job. Pulev, a good top 10 heavyweight. His only previous loss had been 5 years earlier by a knockout to Klitschko, when Klitschko was still going strong. And Joshua took the guy apart. Pulev had never been dominated like that. Anthony looked good in that fight. He beat him up and stopped him. And then, he came up against Usyk. I sometimes think, James, that people sometimes make a little bit too much of a loss. And, because we're in the middle of his career. We don't have the the opportunity to look back. And I say that to you because I was just thinking a couple of days ago was the anniversary of when George Foreman knocked out Joe Frazier to win the heavyweight title. Joe Frazier had beaten Muhammad Ali. He was the heavyweight champ. He had made a couple of defenses, and he goes in the ring as the favorite, I might add, against the big, strong, but lumbering George Foreman. And Frazier's supposed to beat the guy. And not only does George win the fight, he beats the living crap out of Joe Frazier, destroys him, drops him numerous times, stops him in the second round. Now, at that time, you're like, oh my God, Frazier is exposed. He's got nothing. Well, you look back now, 49 years later, and Joe Frazier is regarded as one of the greatest heavyweights ever. He had a horrible night and a bad game plan against George Foreman. And I think maybe when we look back on Joshua's career, or as we have done maybe on Lennox Lewis's career, when he was in the throes of it and got knocked out by Oliver McCall, or later got knocked out by Rockman, people talk about how he's not as good as we think he is, or he was exposed. Well, now that he's been retired for a long time, we look back and we say Lennox Lewis is one of the greatest heavyweights that ever put gloves on. And so I always try to think to myself, not to get too caught up in the emotion of what's happening right this minute with the minutia of this fight. What's he doing in that fight? What's he doing here? What's he doing there? That you have to take the guy's career in totality. And Joshua's career is still a work in progress. And I think that when it's all said and done, he's going to have had some bumps along the way, the same way Lennox Lewis did and Joe Frazier did against George Foreman. But ultimately, he's going to come out the other side, and we're going to see that he was, in fact, one of the top heavyweights of this era.
I think you're right when it comes to records, because at times maybe we as fans, and maybe sometimes in the media, we obsess over it too much. The unbeaten record, what Floyd Mayweather was able to achieve, what Tyson Fury's got now. But when you look at where AJ is now, and it did feel after he lost to Andy Ruiz Jr. in the UK, it felt like the world had ended. But is AJ maybe in a better position than we feel he is in at the moment?
I mean, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think that even if he takes the rematch with Usyk and it happens, Usyk, and I'm not Monday morning quarterbacking, so to speak, and I didn't change my mind, after I saw the first fight. I was saying this before they fought each other when Usyk won the fight. Now, I thought Anthony would win the fight, but never for 2 seconds did I ever think that it was an easy fight. I know the kind of complications that Oleksander Usyk presents opponents. I've covered his career. I've watched virtually every single one of his fights, either on video or live in person. And I know this man is a handful. I mean, he's got super skills. I mean, and because he's part of that great Ukrainian team that produced him, that produced Vasily Lomachenko, that produced the former light heavyweight champion Oleksander Usyk, and others. He's a real difficult, tough opponent. And you have to really be on your game to beat that guy. I mean, he's undefeated. And I always felt like that was going to be a hard fight for Joshua for a lot of different reasons. It turned out that Joshua, I felt like, made it even easier, let's say, for Usyk, because he did fight the completely wrong plan. If you're the guy that's the taller, bigger, stronger guy that has probably, 25 pounds on your opponent, why are you backing up? Why are you slaying on the ropes? Why are you trying to box this man? You got to go in there and bully the guy. If they go back and watch that video, I'm sure that Joshua would agree, and McCracken would probably agree. The game plan they employed just did not work for them. I think that it is a winnable fight in the rematch. It depends on if his head is right and if he's in good shape. But, we'll have to, it remains to be seen, I suppose, if he's going to actually go through with the rematch, because, all that conversation about maybe he'll take a step aside offer to allow Usyk to go and forego that immediate rematch and have a fight with Tyson Fury for the undisputed championship.
That's the next question, really, because we are in a bit of a situation where we're not sure what the next 24 hours, what the next 48 hours will bring. We know there are purse bids that are scheduled for Wednesday when it comes to Fury against White. They've been postponed 3 times already. What do you think happens over the next few days?
I mean, if you're Anthony Joshua and you are going to be presented by your team with an offer from the Usyk camp, that reportedly is going to be upwards of 15 million pounds, around $20 million American, to step aside. When somebody gives you $20 million for doing nothing, swallow your pride and take the money. It's prize fighting. In this case, it can be prize sitting on your rear end, So I'm not sure. I can appreciate the competitive spirit of Anthony Joshua, or any boxer for that matter. But if it was good enough for Lennox Lewis to take, $4 or $5 million to step aside and not fight Mike Tyson, it should be good enough for Anthony Joshua to take 20 million American dollars to step aside and not fight Oleksander Usyk in the next fight. Not to say he'll never get the opportunity again, but certainly, take a break on this. And frankly, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, in my opinion, for Joshua to fight somebody else, get some of that confidence back, and then go into a rematch or fight for the titles for whoever happens to hold them. In the meantime, you have the Fury camp there. Just because Joshua may step aside and take a boatload of money to agree, if they want to do it for the undisputed championship, Tyson Fury and his team, they're going to have to make sure that they take care of Dillian White, who also would be looking presumably at a large amount of money to step aside. Probably not as much as Anthony Joshua, but still millions of dollars to step aside. And if that's the case, we'll see, I assume, the undisputed championship fight between Tyson Fury and Oleksander Usyk, and allow Joshua to go and do his own thing, can still make a big event, even if it's not a championship fight. Dillian White obviously still can have other fights. He's had plenty of good fights over the recent years. Maybe I'm being, I know this won't happen, but what a great thing would it be if the two guys did step aside. We got to see Fury against Usyk for undisputed, and in another fight, we got to see the rematch between Anthony Joshua and Dillian White after their fight earlier in their both careers.
What would you make of it if Dillian White was to agree to step aside? He's spoken for so long about wanting to get his world title opportunity. There's still these arbitrations, numerous arbitrations going on between him and the WBC. But surely if he steps aside now, he'd be waiting a long time. Perhaps he'd never, ever get a world title shot.
Well, that's the kind of discussion that he has to have with himself, the kind of discussion he has to have with those closest to him, his family and the people that he takes counsel from. I mean, look, if Anthony Joshua doesn't take the money to step aside, even $20 million ish, crazy as it sounds, that's not going to change Anthony Joshua's life, because he's already made hundreds of millions of dollars. So, he can live out the rest of his days, as can his children and their children and beyond, if they're not stupid with the money, for generations to come. Dillian White's in a different situation. He's never made big money before. He's never made that kind of payday. So even if he got a fraction of a $20 million step aside, what I've been hearing is somewhere probably in the $5 million range, a lot less, obviously. But $5 million when you're Dillian White, when your biggest purse has really never even really touched $1 million or thereabouts, that's life-changing money. So you have to decide, is it worth it to take the step aside, not fight, not get hit? Still, you're going to probably get a chance along the way somewhere, or force the issue. Maybe Fury vacates and you don't get to fight for the WBC title, and whatever. You don't get to fight Fury for the WBC title. And even if you fight for the WBC title against somebody else, you're still going to make a nice purse, but it probably won't come close to that kind of money that they were offering in step aside. So he's got a lot of things to think about in terms of his competitive spirit and in terms, frankly, of his bank account and the well-being of himself financially. Again, like I said, it's prize fighting. These guys, of course, they do it for legacy. Of course, they do it for the glory. But at the end of the day, I've yet to meet a professional boxer that doesn't do it also for the money.